So we're working on questions and doubts. Now, some of you may remember that on the first Sunday of a series, which was in this case 2 weeks ago, there's a sheet that at least in Sunday school we asked people to fill out. And it's got a number of questions on it. One of the questions is, who do you know who's been working with this theme, in this case questions and doubts, and who might be helpful to speak briefly towards the end of the series that would give us some concrete examples and helps as to what to do. The sheets I've seen were kind of empty on that one this time. But one of the other questions is, what would you like to hear more about? And it was interesting. Some people said, how do we walk with confidence? As in, we've got these questions, we've got some doubts, but how do we still walk with confidence? Or one of the responses was, how do we respond to these questions and doubts? And one person or one group put down, I want to know the answers to the questions, which I get. I've spent a fair amount of my life trying to get the answers to questions. Oftentimes the questions are not necessarily questions that you come up with simple answers. In fact, sometimes those questions are questions that people have been trying to work at for years. Susan claims that my kids are revenge on me for asking too many questions. I have an image, I think I may have mentioned this before, an image in heaven of a room. You might be able to call it the answer room, where, okay, it's a dated picture, a whole bunch of videotapes of every scene of the Bible that you can just pop in and see exactly what happened, because the Bible's kind of brief sometimes on what really happened. And so even reading some of the particular stories, you're left by saying, well, okay, but there's something else to it. This is too brief to be the whole story. So I want to see what happened in real time. But that probably actually wouldn't answer all the questions. It would answer some, and it would probably raise others. But I do have that sort of image that's at least I can check out some stuff that way. But in my experience, sometimes we have really significant questions in our lives. And we go to God and we say to God, this is my question. And God says to us, yeah, good question. But doesn't actually seem to come up with the answer. In fact, God sometimes seems to say, good question, go figure it out. He does promise to be with us. He says, go figure it out. I'll be with you, but go figure it out. But then there's sometimes a hidden subtext that says, where God says, but I'm not going to tell you the answer until you really need it. Really, really need it. In other words, God's saying to us, just trust Him. In the midst of all the questions, and some of them questions I've asked have been questions I've kind of felt I needed the answer for, but God's been saying, just wait. So, one of the questions that I know lots of people ask is, so what's next? You know, we've lived our lives at this point. It's been, fairly good up to this point, but the question is, so what's next? Well, when we came home, or when we were getting ready to come home from Botswana, that was certainly one of the big questions, what's next? Because most of the time in my life, what's next had been fairly obvious. It had sort of worked itself out, and yet coming home from Botswana, there was no next yet. What's next? There was a big blank when we got back. I mean, Mennonite Church Canada keeps you on the payroll for a bit, and you visit some churches for a month or two, but there was nothing else sort of out there. And it was creating a certain level of anxiety for me. And I was talking to God about it and saying, so what's next? It'd be nice if you told me. And, well, since we've been back from Botswana, I've had lots of interviews, but I've had 3 positions. And so 3 interviews that ended in those positions. The first interview was, I think it was about 3 weeks before I started the position in Hamilton. And when that ended, there was a substantial gap between that and when I started in Leamington. And in that case, I had an interview 10 days before I started. It would have been nice to have had a bit more advance notice, but that's the way that God seemed to work. And when I, when I came here, and the interview was about a month before I started, but it happened to be the day before I finished in Leamington, which was pretty much last minute as it felt. So my experience of going to God and asking about what's next is I wasn't getting a 10-year plan. I wasn't getting a 5-year plan. I wasn't even getting a 10-month plan. I was getting you'll know when you need to know. And that seems somehow to often be the way that God works. We don't get the answers, and particularly we don't always get the answers to intellectual questions necessarily very quickly. And yet we shouldn't be all that surprised, because if we say take a look at the Bible and the stories of God with God's people, that seems to often be the way that God worked. That the answers weren't necessarily what was, the answers to the questions didn't necessarily directly correlate to the question that was being asked. So, the text that Greta read today about Moses in the desert with the Israelites and the rock. And it's a wonderful story. And in that case, it seems that Moses, because this is the second time of this story, it seems that Moses was a little bit reluctant to speak to the rock. It didn't have enough pizzazz about it. He felt he needed to do what he'd done before, which was to hit the rock with his rod. But if you notice the first story, which I'll refer to in a second, but the first story, he hit with the rod once. The second story, well, he didn't start by hitting the rock. He started with this big speech about the people and how they weren't listening to God. And, he had to, it was a big show. And then he hit the rock, but he didn't hit it once, he hit it twice. He wasn't entirely comfortable with just speaking to the rock and commanding, which is what God asked him to do. Well, the first time this story, the bits of this story happened was in Exodus chapter 16 and 17. And almost exactly the same thing happened. But one of the things we're told in that story, the second story seemed to be about Moses and his doubts, but the first one was about the people and their doubts. And so they started off by complaining about a lack of water, but they ended up, we're told, that the real issue wasn't the water. I mean, the water was an issue. They were thirsty. But the real issue was God with us or not? Now, that's a question that oftentimes many of us could ask. Is God with us or not? And what was the answer to that question? Well, there could be all sorts of ways that God could have answered that question. I mean, they were walking through the desert with the cloud and the pillar of fire and all that sort of stuff. And so there could have been a number of ways that God could have said, guys, look, here's the list. But that's not what happened. The answer to the question, is God with us or not, was water, which is what they needed. And so sometimes we're really good at putting those sort of things together and go, okay, God provided the water, therefore we know that God is with us. The Israelites in the desert seemed to struggle because they often kept on coming back to the same sort of question, is God with us or not? But I think that's also true for us in the questions that we ask. Sometimes the real question we're asking isn't what the words that we're asking. The real question we're asking is God with us? And we don't often actually get that answer spelled out. We may or may not get water gushing from a rock, but the answer seems to often be in the things that happen in the journey. So that's one way that God sometimes seems to answer questions. We get a sort of a practical result. Another question, a question that Jesus asks, or the disciples ask Jesus, in Luke chapter 11. They say to Jesus that Jesus had just been praying, and the disciples said to Jesus, we don't know how to pray like that. Teach us how to pray. And Jesus at that point gave them a very specific prayer. We call it the Lord's Prayer. Jesus answered their question with a fairly direct answer, but that's sort of an exception. Oftentimes, when the disciples ask Jesus a question, they don't get a straightforward answer like that. So it can happen, but it's not typical. What seems to be far more typical is this sort of thing, if I can read it here. So this is coming from Matthew chapter 8. And there's two, I'm going to read four verses here. When Jesus saw the crowd, he went across Lake Galilee. A teacher of the law of Moses came up to him and said, "Teacher, I'll go anywhere with you." And Jesus replied, "Foxes have dens and birds have nests, but the Son of Man doesn't have a place to call his own." Not a particularly direct answer, but that's not the one I want to focus on. It's the next one. Another disciple said to Jesus, "Lord, let me wait till I bury my father." And Jesus answered, "Come with me and let the dead bury the dead," which is a very interesting answer. I want to read it in another version. Just the last bit. Another of his disciples said to him, "Lord, first let me go and bury my father," which sounds like his father's already dead. The other one sounds like his father's still living, and he's saying, "I'll follow you, but just let me wait till my father dies." It raises a lot of questions. Something's funny about this statement. Either the father's living and the disciple, this person who claims to be a disciple, I mean, that's what it says, he's a disciple. He's not a Pharisee, he's not a teacher of the law, but he's a disciple. Maybe he's trying to find an excuse to put off following Jesus. Or maybe his father's dead and he's saying, "I've got a funeral to work on," but if his father's dead, what's he doing with Jesus? And Jesus' response seems to have some strangeness about it, because in that society, respecting elders was a huge deal. And saying, "Let the dead bury the dead," doesn't sound like respecting the elders much. And burying people properly was another big deal. So the passage raises lots of questions, but it's interesting to see what Jesus' ultimate answer is to all of these questions that are raised. The answer is, "Come. Come with me." It's interesting that Jesus is, at the very beginning of the Gospels, we're told that Jesus was also called Emmanuel, which means God with us. So in one sense, Jesus is saying to this disciple and to all of us, "Come. Come spend time with me so that I can be God with you. I can be Emmanuel." So Jesus answered this disciple, but not how he would have expected. I mean, he was hoping to be told, "Yep, go deal with your business and come back." And that wasn't what happened. What he was told was, "Come. Come with me." So there's three questions that I've just looked at. One was a question about, is God really with us? And the answer was water out of a rock. One was a very practical question, "Lord, teach us to pray," and they were given the Lord's Prayer. And one was a question about something about fathers and burying and putting off the following bit. And Jesus says, "Come, get your priorities right, and come connect with me, be in a relationship with me." And I think that oftentimes the questions that we ask are more about, that the answer than that third question is often the answer that we really need. It doesn't solve the problems. It doesn't end the questions. But what Jesus is saying is, "Come. Be in a relationship with me. Know me, and let me know you, and let that make a difference in your lives." Now, to be clear, following Jesus doesn't answer all the questions. The questions are all still there. The questions that I was asking in terms of what's next were still there, whether I'm following Jesus or not. But somehow in the following of Jesus, things get changed up a bit. So while Jesus' invitation to us to follow him doesn't answer the questions, somehow as we follow Jesus, as we get to know Jesus, as the relationship builds, we can live with the questions. We can live with the questions that are answered, because sometimes there are answers, and the answers work for us, and we can live with them. And sometimes the answers, the questions are partially answered. Sometimes the questions we have aren't really answered at all. And sometimes the questions we ask are answered, and then some years later we discover that those answers are not quite working for us anymore, and we need to ask the question again to further figure out what's up. But as we walk with Jesus, it's not that the questions go away even, but that we can walk with confidence with Jesus and let the questions work themselves out a little bit on the side. I think sometimes part of the solution is that we are looking for the answer that will work for us through our whole lives, for everybody around the world at all time. And that's just not the way it works. And sometimes I wonder if we would be better off not looking for the answer to our questions, but looking for a working hypothesis. I almost went into sciences when I went to university. And a working hypothesis is something that you take into consideration all the facts that you know, and you put it together in a way that is the best explanation you have for the way it can happen, knowing that it's probably going to get refined in the future. And I think that sometimes for our Christian walk, that would be the better way of going, rather than trying to find the definitive answer, is rather to try and find the best possible answer with all the facts that we know right now. So the facts would be our experiences, the experiences of more mature people around us, what we read in Scripture, what we read in other sources of other Christian lives, maybe take some courses, take a theology course. Ivan keeps talking about courses he's taking at Grable, and it's wonderful. And we put all that stuff together to try and say, okay, how can I answer this question to make it work right now? Now, to be clear, I'm not saying that the answer is the answer I like best, or the answer that feels nice, because that's not the facts. And if we do it that way, we end up in a pretty slippery slope. We need to take into consideration all that we know, but sometimes we just don't know it all. And yet we're trying to get a definitive answer. At some point in our lives, the questions that we're asking, even though they're really important questions, need to be not necessarily set aside, not to disappear, but we need to be able to say, it's not an intellectual exercise. Christianity is not about getting all the answers right, and if we get enough answers right, we get into heaven. Christianity is about knowing Jesus. And so at some point, we need to be able to say about the questions, they're important. They need to be worked on, but they're not the most important thing ever. The most important thing is the relationship with Jesus. And sometimes what we end up by doing, whether it's intentionally or not, is putting the questions up as a roadblock that prevents us from really getting to know Jesus. And what we need to do is to let the questions They're real questions. They need to be answered. They need to be worked at, but setting them to the side a bit so we can get to know Jesus. But that's risky. Really getting to know Jesus can be a lot less safe, or it feels a lot less safe than having those questions there that we've had for so long and we can sort of depend on. Sometimes we need to set the questions aside and follow. One of the issues is that the questions that we ask, and I mean, some of those were the questions that were up on the board 2 weeks ago. They're really good questions, but they're questions that have been asked for thousands of years, since people have been recording these sort of discussions. And it's perhaps even arrogant for us to say, until I get the right answer, or the whole answer, I'm not going to move forward with following Jesus. Because people have been trying for a long time. People who devote their life to thinking about this sort of thing have struggled with many of those same sort of questions. So a question like, how do I know that God exists? Lots of people ask that question. It's a great question. It's not so easy to answer. People have tried. People have said they've come up with great answers, and then someone comes along and says, well, your answer's got these flaws to it. It's not that easy. So you think about it, in our life, as we journey through our lives, we actually answer that question in different ways at different times in our life. So part of the answer to that question is, what's our own experience with God? How has God touched our lives? And there may be times in our lives when it's really clear that we've really been able to see God at work in our lives. Or maybe we know people that we really trust, who are able to say, I have seen God at work in my life just now. And that gives us confidence. That tells us, yeah, God's at work. Or maybe we spend time reading scriptures and reading the Bible, and in reading the Bible we see these stories and they connect with us, and we go, yeah, because I'm seeing that story and it fits with my life, and I get it, and this is a confirmation for me that God exists. For some of us, as we have aged, we can look back at our lives and see God's hand at work in the long trajectory, where at the time it was, things were happening, we were learning something or whatever, but it wasn't necessarily that we were able to say that we can, that I can look back in my life and say, look at this. In these times, I can see that God's hand was at work in my life and has got me to the place where I am today. That's for me, a significant confirmation of God's presence in my life. But when I was 22 or 25, I wouldn't have been able to see that. And so the answer to the question, how do I know that God exists, is a different answer that I can give now than I could give when I was much younger. So there's lots of ways that we can work at answering that question, and it will shift over time. And I know from my own life, there have been times when I have sat and I've wondered, does God really exist? And then I go back and review the answers I've had in the past, and it's built, and maybe there's new things that have been added to it, and I've been able to feel the confirmation in that answer, but it's not a straightforward answer, and it's not necessarily an answer that's going to convince an atheist. It's an answer that convinces me, where I've already said, I'm walking with God. So the question is not a straightforward question to answer, and as we journey through our lives, we resolve it in different ways at different times. The thing that I find amazing is that Jesus, when he spoke to that young man and said, come, wasn't saying come. He didn't say, go get your life in order and then come. That's what the young man was trying to ask. Jesus said, come. The other stuff will fall into place. Get your priorities right, come follow me. And Jesus says that to us too. We don't have to have our lives together. We don't have to have all the answers answered. We don't have to have everything thought through before we can say yes to following Jesus. And that, for me, is incredible good news. Jesus says, come. Even though you've got doubts and questions, come. And for me, one of the amazing confirmations of Jesus welcoming is in the events of Easter. So starting next week is Palm Sunday, and then we've got the various events of Holy Week, the things, the Last Supper, and then Good Friday, and then Sunday. And you think about the disciples, the ones that Jesus had said, come. You think of what they did in that time span. Did they have their act together? Well, Palm Sunday, they go marching into Jerusalem thinking that they're the head of a triumphant army or something, and they were fearless against what was really a really dumb thing when you think about it. You've got the Romans up there who are not happy about unauthorized gatherings. You've got the rulers of the temple who are not happy about this preacher guy, and here they are marching up to Jerusalem with things waving around and singing and making a big noise. Not the wisest thing. The disciples really were clearly showing they didn't have a clue as to what was happening. And then Maundy, Thursday, the supper where Jesus had with the disciples, the first communions, and the things that happen around the table there. I mean, the statements of confidence in the disciples. We'll never desert you, Jesus. Yeah, well, 12 hours later they did. But not that night. They were full of, clearly, confidence that had no reason. And then that night out when they're praying and Jesus is saying to them, just pray with me, and they just fall asleep. And then Friday they all scattered. Well, that night they all scattered. Afraid. So clearly, the disciples that Jesus chose didn't have it all together. And Jesus still said to them, come. And so that's what, for me, is an incredible affirmation and we can remember that as we take a look at the stories of the disciples through the Easter season. Keep remembering that. These are the guys that Jesus said, come, and they weren't getting it. And when we are invited to come, Jesus who invites us to come, and if we don't get it all, it's not the end of the world, because Jesus is used to that. He's used to having people following him who really didn't get it. So for me, this is incredible good news, affirmed in Easter. So even with all of the questions and the doubts and the absolute, the disciples just weren't getting it, Jesus says to the disciples and to us, I know you. I know what you need. And I will be with you always. And that gives me a great deal of hope. Let's pray. Lord, in the midst of our doubts, our questions, you say that you walk with us. Help us to hold on to that and gain strength from that, gain confidence. Help us to walk with you. In Jesus' name.